Not all railway modellers have the luxury of a permanent layout in the attic or shed. Many of us settling for a portable one, only coming out when we want to do some work on it, or just to run some trains. And like exhibition layouts, it's really helpful if they're modular, so they can be stored away and only assembled when required. But for that, we're going to need a way to join the sections. And in this video, I'm going to share some of the methods I use, letting you into some secrets for achieving neat, reliable joins that make putting your layout together really easy. The first of these is a way to make sure that your baseboard and frame line up exactly every time you assemble it. And for this I've got some alignment dowels, these particular ones made by DCC Concepts. But my secret isn't what I'm using, it's that I'm fitting them during construction rather than afterwards, starting by marking up the centres on my two end battens, which aren't even cut to length yet. Then with them carefully aligned, I can drill a single pilot hole through both at the same time, ensuring my dowels will be in exactly the same place on both sides of the join. Then one by one I can confidently enlarge the holes, starting with the 19mm recess for the flange, checking the depth with an inverted one, before flipping over the frame section to drill the 13mm hole for the main barrel of the dowel. Of course, the frame for your baseboard is going to look a lot different to mine, but the method is the same. And with the holes drilled and cleaned out a bit, I can practice fit the dowels, ensuring the face of the flange is flush with the surface of the batten. And with all four in place, I've got the foundations for a really neat join. Then, keeping the battens together as a pair, I can mark them up and cut them to length, knowing that they'll be exactly the same as each other. And when I come to fit them to the baseboard, they'll match perfectly. Now I know the construction of my circular layout is quite unusual, but I hope it's relatively clear to see how the technique will translate to a more traditional wooden frame with a plywood surface. The trick being to build around your alignment dowels rather than trying to add them later. Now, after temporary removal for painting, it's time to glue them in place, making sure we get the correct half of each pair in the right hole, so they match when we put the baseboard together. Now we've got the two halves lined up, we need a way to keep them like that. Which brings me to secret number 2, which couldn't be simpler. Just using a loose pin hinge to bridge the gap, securing the joint by inserting the pin as soon as everything's in place. I got this idea from stage scenery, where a similar technique is used for joining the frames of the flats, hidden away behind the scenes. But mine are going to be partially visible, so I want to make them look good, and having sprayed them the colour of my baseboard, I need to cut a rebate, so they lie flush with the surface. Obviously, if you're joining bits of an underframe, you may not need to go to this trouble, and you can just screw the two halves of the hinge directly to the timbers. But don't forget they need to be accessible, so you can put in the pins. My hinges are flat on the surface of the board, which will always be either on the floor or a tabletop. And they don't have any structural function, they're just there to hold the gap shut, so a smallish screw is going to be more than enough to keep them in place. But for a baseboard with an underframe, you could use 2 or more hinges to keep the whole thing rigid, but you'd want to use some chunkier hardware. With half of my hinge screwed down firmly, I just want to test that gap to make sure it's fully closed before screwing down the other half. Then I'll know I've got a tight fit every time I assemble the board. Now with a little bit of filler and some more black paint, I just need to tidy them up. Next we come to the slightly trickier task of getting our track over that gap, which is made much easier using these rail aligners. The precision zigzag join ensures they butt together perfectly and can even be used at a slight angle. But before we get on with installation, I just want to use my favourite trick, spraying my track bed with stone effect textured paint, giving us a head start for the ballasting to come. Then I can start marking up for the track joins. Our alignment dowels and loose pin hinges are keeping our sections together nicely, but our rail aligners offer that last little bit of precision, down to a fraction of a millimetre, ensuring our tracks line up perfectly on either side of the gap. The rails are going to be soldered to the track aligners, so the first thing I need to do is remove some of the sleepers. Then with the track accurately positioned where it's going to go, I can start lining up the aligners, just protruding slightly over the ends of my baseboards, bridging that 2mm gap, so our tracks will be virtually continuous over it. Then a final check of the measurements before gluing down. For this I'm using some squeezed out no more nails, spread with an old membership card, on both the baseboard and the back of the rail aligner, giving me really good adhesion, cleaning up any excess with the end of a wooden skewer, before putting the track back in place, with a final check of the measurements, tweaking the position if required. Then repeating for the other half of the pair. They're easy to line up with that zigzag, but make sure the surfaces are level too. We don't want a step in our rail join. Then having checked, double checked, and even triple checked, we can leave our glue to dry. Then on to the next pair, following exactly the same procedure, carefully measuring, marking, then spreading the glue, and sticking down the aligner, one half at a time, cleaning up any excess glue before leaving it to dry. And when it is, we can lay our track. Now everyone has their own preferred method for track laying, and they all work equally well with the aligners. But I favour gluing down the track and ballasting as I go. With the stone textured spray paint, this gives me a good initial overall effect, which I'll add to and finesse over time. But whatever your method, just make sure your track is down firmly before going on to the next step, which is to solder the rails to the track aligners. Now I'm pretty sure you could glue them using something like araldite, but soldering is definitely best, and you don't have to be that great at soldering for good results. My tip here would be to heat up the cladding on the top of the rail aligner, rather than the rail itself, and then feed in the solder from the side, which will flow between the rail and the track aligner. Just make sure any blobs of solder are on the outside edges of the rails, where they won't interfere with the flanges on your wheels. Now on to laying the track on the other side of my join, which I'm doing in exactly the same way. And when I get to the soldering, I can make sure my tracks are aligned perfectly, making any final adjustments with the tips of my long nose pliers. I've deliberately left a tiny gap between the rails to allow for expansion, but it's the accuracy of the lineup that matters, and my trains will clip across that nicely. As well as bridging the gap physically, we're going to need electrical continuity, and there are several ways of achieving this. Some alignment dowels even include electrical contacts, but I've come up with something that's even simpler. It's one of those experiments that worked out better than expected, so it does look a little bit messy, but it does actually work really well. Proving that you should never throw anything away, I found some little bits of brass sheet in my scraps box, and I've just trimmed them into rectangles and bent them over into an L shape, fitting them in pairs into the narrow gap, gluing the top bits with superglue. The brass has enough twang to it to keep the unglued bits down the gap in contact for my power connection. Then I can wire each tab to my rail aligners, completing the circuit for each rail. And because on my DCC layout both tracks share a common power supply and are wired together elsewhere, I only need 2 pairs of connectors. One day I'll get round to doing a neater job, but that's purely cosmetic. And in the meantime, the combination of alignment dowels, loose pin hinges, soldered track aligners, and my slightly Heath Robinson electrical connectors make for easy assembly baseboard joins with accurate rail alignment that doesn't faze even my fussiest engines.